Now we've got all the controls in place, we can leave it at that point, or what I'm going to do now is actually look at see if I can change some of the styling that's been applied to the controls and the way our calculator will look. Some of the things I like to do is actually add a border around the numeric display there so it's more easy to see where the display should be. I'd also like to change the look of these buttons and the look of the background as well. So let's start on our label since we've got that there, and we'll go across here to the properties. You can also do this in the XAML as well, obviously. And what we want to do is set a border thickness. So I'm going to set a border thickness of 1 for left, right, top and bottom, and I also need to actually set a border brush. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to say it's a solid color, and I can choose a color. So let's pick something a little bit different. We don't want to have a, I don't know. Yeah, that's probably about right. Border brush. So let's see what that looks like when we actually go ahead and run our application. And now you can see that we've got a border around the input there, which I think makes it much more obvious what we're doing. Next, I want to change the background. So back into the XAML here, I'm going to go up to the top and find the beginning of my grid, which is on this line here. This is the grid that basically is, if you like, the master grid which we started with when we first created our WPF application. And I'm going to go ahead and change its background. So across here in the properties for the grid, I'm going to find the background. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to say now that it's a gradient, and as soon as I do that, you'll see that this new panel pops up in the properties here to allow me to adjust things. You'll also see that by default we get a gradient from black to white, and you can see the effect on the actual control over here. Not really what I'm after, so I'm going to click on the first one and I'm going to put that pretty much to white as well. Click on the last one, and then I'm going to modify the control a little bit. It looks okay. So that's given me a little bit of a gradient there, going from a dark colour up to a lighter one. You can tinker with that until you get something that takes your fancy. And next I'm going to apply the same principle to the buttons. So let's see how that looks. I'm going to start with clicking on, let's try 0 since that's a nice large button. We can see that quite clearly. I'm going to go into the background again, click on it, choose a gradient. Let's get that, and let's again make that a light colour, and let's go to the reverse. Let's just put a little bit of a tint on the button, like so. Okay, that looks pretty good, so let's just run it to see that and get a bit of a preview. So now you can see I've added a gradient to the background. I've also got a very subtle gradient on my buttons. Now of course I'm going to have to apply that gradient to each one of these buttons, and trying to do that manually through the properties window would be very difficult. I could of course copy and paste this information here that's been created in XAML. This is to do with the actual gradient settings themselves, and I could do it that way. But that's going to work, but it's going to create an awful lot of XAML code, and what's going to happen of course is, since we've got so many buttons that we'd actually have to set that gradient for, it's not going to take very long at all before this is going to get huge and a lot more difficult to read. Certainly it's going to be a lot more difficult to update. So our last step is to look at how we could actually go ahead and apply styles to our buttons and our background and so forth. This is the same concept as you'd have in CSS, where you're using a CSS file to apply a look to a web page, for example. We'll start off with our buttons. If we have a look at our buttons here, you can see that they've all got a margin of 5, and this is true for all of them. So that means if later on, while we're experimenting and testing our application, we decide that that margin isn't enough and we'd like to make it larger, for example, as things currently stand, we'll have to go through every single button in the XAML and modify the margin setting. What would be nice is if we could have a default margin setting for these buttons that we can easily change in one place and have it affect all the buttons concerned. So that's what we're going to do. If I go back up into the XAML at the top here, where I want to be basically is just before the grid and just after that last line with the title. So I put a space in there, and I'm going to create what's called a window tab dot resources, and then I'm going to use the greater than sign there to close it off. So in here I can set up the properties for the styling. The first one we're going to use is called, not surprisingly, style. So let's go ahead and put that in there. We're going to name our style, so I'm going to put X key equals, and then I'm going to call this numeric button margin. Now in my copy of Visual Studio, this is actually sort of ghosted. It shouldn't be in yours. That's to do with the third-party tool I'm using, so you'll have to just bear with me on that. The next thing we have to tell Windows or WPF is what does this style actually impact on? In other words, what control is it for? Is it for a grid? Is it for a list? Is it for a drop-down combo? In this case, it's for a button. So I need to say that the target type equals button. Then I'll put a greater sign on the end, which gives me the closing tag. And then in the middle, I can actually define what this style will be. And I do that using what's called a setter. So I'm going to say the setter, and then I'm going to say the property, which is basically the name of the property that you would normally see over here. So in this case, the name of the property will be margin, and then a value, which will be what is the default. So we'll leave it at 5. Then I need to close the setter. So I'm going to use the shortcut there, which allows you to close the tag on one line, which is just the / and the greater sign on the end. Now if I had other properties that I wanted to set for my button, I could go right on ahead and continue to add those in there, and you can have as many in there as you need for each control that you're setting up. But in this case we just want the margin. So that's set up the style, but it hasn't yet applied the style to any of our numeric buttons. So let's have a look at how that might work. So I'm going to go down and find one of my buttons here. So here we've got buttons that display 7. And just to prove to you that the style is working, let's delete the margin. So you can see now that that button is now taking up the full amount of room available to it. And let's do the same for the other two buttons on that particular row. And let's now restore that margin by using that style that we've already defined up the top and under Windows Resources. So for this one, I'm just going to go over to the properties here. I'm in the button row here, and I'm going to go down the list of properties until I find style. There it is there. I'm going to click on the little box next to it. I'm going to say that I'm applying a local resource, and as soon as I select that, you can see that it picks up that we have a style, and so it says numeric button margin, which is correct. I'm going to select that, and if we look at our button 7 now, you can see that it's restored the margin around it. The great advantage of this, of course, is that now if I go up here to the style and I go ahead and change that margin, let's make it something fairly radical like 25. Well, maybe that's a bit too radical. 15 works. You can see now we've got a margin 15 around that button. So as soon as we apply that style to any of these other buttons, they'll inherit that style setting, and we can easily then change the margin in one location. Now there's one other thing to note. When I created this style, it actually put in the XAML dynamic resource. That means that every time that button is drawn, essentially, WPF is going to have a look and see what are the current style settings for this button. That's because in WPF, if you wish, you can change the styles over time. That might be useful in some more advanced applications. In this one, once we're happy with the margins and things like that on our buttons, we're not going to go ahead and change them. So we can in fact go ahead and change that from a dynamic resource and say that it's going to be a static resource instead. That simply means that once you've read it once, that's what the setting is, and it's going to stay that way for the lifetime of the application. Now I've got that XAML code in place, I can copy it and of course paste that into the other two buttons in that row, and as soon as I do that, you'll see that that restores the margins for them. So visually now it looks the same as the other ones, except of course we've only have to go to one place to make any changes to the style for that button instead of having to go to each individual one. So what I'm going to do now is update the other two rows so they all use a static resource and don't have a reference to the margin.